Alphonsian Prayer. And for the first half hour or so this evening, give me the next one, I want to talk a little bit with you about Alphonsus. I'm going to introduce Alphonsus and say something about his method of prayer to you. Alphonsus, I suppose you could say, is a teacher of contemplative prayer for ordinary people. That's always been, I think, one of the things that Redemptorists specialised in, was communicating the gospel to ordinary folk. And very much for Alphonsus, who was born into a noble family in Naples, but most of his priesthood was spent actually working in the countryside, in the hills to the south of Italy, above places like Sorrento and Amalfi. And Alphonsus then comes in contact with very, very ordinary folk and very ordinary people. There are three key books in Alphonsus. Alphonsus is also a writer as well as a preacher and a teacher and a missionary. But there are three fairly important books that we can get some flavour of in this single book here called The Spirituality of Alphonsian Prayer, which has extracts from many of those books. And the three books that are in prayer, I have named them here. The first one, A Way of Conversing with God as with a Friend, which was written in 1753. And then there is one called Prayer, the Great Means of Salvation. In a sense, this is the closest that Alphonsus comes to a theology of prayer. What prayer is about, and how it fits into the mystery of God's dealings with us. And then the third classic Alphonsian text is something called The Practice of the Love of Jesus Christ. It too was produced about 1767, where Alphonsus is, by this stage, a fairly elderly man. Not in great health, but drawing on the fruits of a long, long life, to give what he believed to be the secret of the spiritual life, which is the mystery of the love of God. And how we can respond to that love of God. And he does it very simply, because the second part of the book is actually a commentary on that great chapter in the first letter to the Corinthians, chapter 13, Paul's hymn to love. Follow, can we come on to the next page here? Let me talk a little bit about Alphonsus' background. Alphonsus himself was born in Naples in 1696. Easy to remember, 6 years after the Battle of the Boyne. Very easy to remember that, and that was a difficult enough time in Ireland. So if you associate Alphonsus with King Billy, you're not going too far wrong. Alphonsus was himself formed in the way of prayer by his own family. He was a lawyer. He did his law degree, his doctorate in law at the age of about 16, and was a burning luminary in the Neapolitan law field. And then he loses a case, and his glorious world begins to go down the tubes. And he decides, 1726, he's going to become a priest. His father, who had ambitions for him, is horrified. And they have an almighty row. And Alphonsus goes off to a place called the Chinese College, which was for training missionaries for the foreign missions, and he becomes a priest there. And then, 1732, 6 years ordained, goes off to have a little holiday in the south of Italy and discovers, to his horror, the spiritual deprivation of the country folk, especially of the young men, the boys, who were the shepherds of the sheep and goats and those high hills over the coast of Amalfi. The earliest influence on Alphonsus' prayer life was Saint Teresa of Avila. He probably learned about Teresa from his mother, who was a great reader of Teresa's literature. And Teresa's influence was very strong in Naples because of the Spanish influence in Naples as a whole at this time. The Spanish royal family had put one of their own on the throne of Naples. And so Naples and Spain are very rich. Teresa was born 1715. Again, easy way to remember that. 2 years before the Reformation. And she dies in 15, what's it now there? Let me look at that. 1582. Which goes back to Alphonsus, about 100 years or so before Alphonsus is born. So this woman, Teresa of Avila, is writing again at a time of change to the church. She reforms a religious order called the Carmelites and brings them back to the basis of contemplative life, which is contemplative prayer. And she writes about that, writes beautifully and wonderfully, and also with tremendous wit. Teresa is my favourite woman saint. Not the one Therese, the little Therese. She's a wee bit too sweet to be wholesome. But Therese is one of these lovely, witty women who has wise things to say and says them very well. And she had a great influence on Alphonsus' learning how to pray. And so when he comes to write his own books on Alphonsus, Teresa is the big influence that is behind him. Teresa was a mystic, but a very practical mystic. She has, one of her very wise sayings is, living in a community that often fasted, she said, there's a time for fasting, but there's a time for pheasant. Very wise. A time for fasting and a time for pheasant. She also, was, as I said, was a mystic, but not in the sense of her great companion John of the Cross, who talked about the dark night of the soul. For Teresa, the key to entering into the mystical union with God was the incarnation of Jesus Christ. The story of how God comes among us in the person of Christ. And this is something that Alphonsus too will have at the back of his mind whenever he's talking about prayer. That the great prayer event in our lives is the story of the incarnation. Another part of Alphonsus' background is this. That chap whose picture you see there, his name is Cornelius Johnson. Alphonsus never met him. He had been a university lecturer in the University of Leuven, or Louvain in Belgium, which is still there, still a Catholic university in Belgium to this very day. And his dates are I have to put on my glasses to see this. 1585 to 1638. As I said, Alphonsus never met him. Very few of the people who set about propagating his doctrine had ever met him. But he wrote one famous book called the Augustinus that was actually about grace. See, at the end of the day, you'll always define who you are as a believer and as a Catholic, as a Protestant, by how you understand grace. Grace, God's grace. What is God's grace and what does God's grace mean? Jansenius had a very bleak view, I think, about God's grace. And the group that followed him had an equally bleak view about the meaning of God's grace. They thought, for example, that the thing to emphasize was the negative. How badly the human story was blighted by original sin. Everything goes wrong in original sin, we're still carrying it around with us. Now, just a small footnote to that. That's actually not a Catholic view. Because if you go back to the great Catholic hymn on grace, which we sing still every Easter vigil, the great Exultet, "O happy fault, O truly necessary sin of Adam, that had gained for us so great a Redeemer." In other words, in this Catholic view, original sin isn't the last word. Original sin is actually part of the way to grace and part of the story of grace. And yet, these people who followed Johnson become known as Jansenists. They largely flourished in France. By and large, they were what I would say fairly aristocratic and intellectual. One of my favourite writers of the 17th century is a man called Blaise Pascal. I just absolutely love Pascal. But Pascal was a Jansenist. He had that bleak view of the human story. And that bleak view of the human story, as I said, begins in a sense with original sin. And it then goes into what we call predestination. What are we called to be? Are we called to be saved? Or are we predestined to hell? That's a doctrine also that some Protestant churches get into. Again, we're talking about grace. What are we called to be? Are we called to be saved? Or are we called to suffer and to be, as it were, damned? That also applies to other things, how we live. And so that the administration of the sacraments under the Jansenists becomes fairly horrific. Confession. The Jansenists were very, very strict guys when it came to thinking about sin. And especially trying to get people to examine their lives in preparation for confession. And so the confession becomes an ordeal. And the confessor mightn't even give you absolution until he's sure that you're genuinely sorry for your sins. And along with that, Holy Communion. You didn't go to Holy Communion that often. The church required you to go once a year at Easter time. The Jansenists would have said, well, that's enough for most of you lot. And along with that then goes the thing that for us lot, who actually are very good, we can go more frequently. And so this sense of an aristocratic, intellectual layer of Catholicism, and below it, the great ordinary mass of ordinary people who know sin and who are condemned to a very bleak form of existence. Now, that Jansenist heresy, as I said, flourished in France and in parts of Europe. Also perhaps had an influence on Ireland because a lot of Irish Catholic priests were trained on the continent and probably brought it back with them to Ireland. And so that bleakness is there. And it's something that Alphonsus begins to experience as a young man. As a young man training for the priesthood, many of the books on moral theology that he was reading were what we would call rigorist. There was an influence of Jansenist thought and Jansenist influence in them. And yet, as Alphonsus goes on, he realizes just how absolutely wrong this view of life is. That there's some sort of a denial of the meaning of real grace. And so Alphonsus, going out among these ordinary people, looking at them, these ordinary country working people, how can God create them to damn them? He has created them to save them. He has created them for heaven. And so Alphonsus' preaching as a missionary becomes that proclamation of the gospel of salvation, a call certainly to repentance and to a better way of living, but also to the administration of the sacrament of confession in a humane way, and recognizing the rights of conscience, that people might make mistakes, genuinely think they were doing the right thing. Maybe perhaps somebody may say, well, it wasn't right, it may have been sinful. But Alphonsus says, you've got to listen to their conscience, and you've got to go with them and see what they're doing. And so this sense that we have of Alphonsus as this man, he's very, very close, I would suggest to you, to Pope Francis. You see that same benignity in Francis, that same ability to say, I don't know. I got to trust people. I've got to encourage people to do the best they can do. And so Alphonsus then sees this, and Alphonsus' doctrine of prayer is about grace. Alphonsus believes in abundance of grace. And so part of that is that anybody, Alphonsus, in that book, The Prayer, the Great Means of Salvation, there's one very important sentence. The one who prays will certainly be saved. And for Alphonsus, that idea of people praying is their desire for God. And he'd even say, it really doesn't matter what they do or how long the prayer is. He has all sorts of stories, particularly in one of his books called The Glories of Mary, of all sorts of very, very wild men. They're usually wild men rather than wild women, who do unspeakable things, but somewhere in their lives they'll say the Hail Mary. Or they have never passed a statue of Our Lady without making the sign of the cross. Or they have remembered to bring a bunch of flowers to Our Lady on the feast day. And Alphonsus says, is this enough? Is this enough to save them? You say, yes. This is their desire. This is their desire for God. And that even these very, very small gestures of hope and devotion are part of the heart that is striving to find its way towards God. A couple of years ago, Pope Francis had a most lovely book of letters to children. And one of the letters in it was from a little boy whose father had committed suicide. This little child wants to know, is my daddy damned? And Francis tells him a story. For another great saint, the Curé of Ars, John Vianney. A woman had come to John Vianney to say that her husband had committed suicide. And what was his present state? And John says one very small, simple thing. Madam, between the bridge and the river is the mercy of God. He jumped off a bridge into the Seine. Between the bridge and the river is the mercy of God. I was telling one of my old Redemptorists brothers this story. I said, yes, he said, there's a line that we learned when we were preaching. The story of the robber who was trying to make his escape and fell off his horse. Where did he go? And he says, between the saddle and the ground, mercy sought and mercy found. Between the saddle and the ground, mercy sought and mercy found. You see, this is, in a sense, with this, we're coming very much to the heart of Alphonsus on prayer. It's not really about how well you can do it, but it is about the very desire that you have to come to God and to find God. Between the saddle and the ground, mercy sought and mercy found. Follow, can we move on to the next one? I want to talk for a little while now about Alphonsus' method of prayer. As I said, he really learned it from Teresa of Avila. And all the time he keeps referring back to Teresa of Avila. And if anything, what he is giving is an even more simplified method of Teresa. And he says, for example, that Teresa, for a lot of her life, found prayer so difficult that she never went to a prayer time without bringing with her a book. So that when it was difficult, she could open her book and read a little bit. Now, Alphonsus' method of prayer is a bit like that, and we're going to experiment on it tonight for a while. It begins with the idea of preparation. In a sense, the remote preparation for prayer, we can call it that, is the everyday attempt to live the message of the gospel. The fact that we try to live by the gospel of Jesus Christ is actually preparing our hearts for prayer. But then when we come to a time of prayer, there is what we may call the immediate or the proximate preparation. Well, this is just, in a sense, entering into a time of prayer by taking time to quieten ourselves down. Whether it is by spending some time gently breathing, trying to be quiet, fixing your mind on some object like a crucifix or something else, something that will help you to focus and concentrate, and then asking for help. The first prayer that we actually make is a prayer for light, for guidance. During this time of prayer, that God will guide us in our prayer time, and that He and His grace will help us to experience His presence, and will bring us to know what we need to ask for. And so having done that, the next act of prayer in this Alphonsian method is reading. It's not that we try to read a whole lot, we're not trying to read a whole chapter of the Gospel, but that sometimes we need to read something such as a Gospel story, very good way to start, or a little passage from a book. We read it slowly, and we read it again. Somebody has said that in prayer we always should read at least twice. Once for the head and once for the heart. And sometimes we might even need to read it a fourth time. And sometimes as we do that bit of reading, we'll be focusing maybe just on one sentence, or maybe even on one word. And that moves us on to the next stage, which is reflecting, thinking about what we have read. What does it mean? And especially, what does it mean for me? And even more especially, what does it mean for me here and now? Is this asking me to do something? To make some change? Spend some time reflecting. And then almost imperceptibly, we move into what Alphonsus calls affections, or affetti in Italian. That's a strange sort of a word, but really what it means, I suppose, is the prayer of the heart. We're beginning to allow our heart to talk. Our heart to talk simply in its own way. As Alphonsus says in that great book, talking familiarly to God as if to a friend. And sometimes those affections that we make, those spontaneous movements of the heart, you can summarize them perhaps even more simply under the word acts, adoration, contrition, sorrow for sin, recognizing just how awful you have sometimes acted. What a wretch you sometimes are. But God has forgiven you. And so it moves you on to thanksgiving. That you are who you are. And as you look further, you see all the gifts that you have been given. The gift of creation. The gift of life. The gift of your family. Supplication. Asking. What things do you need to ask for? And as I said for Alphonsus, that asking is part and parcel of prayer. What am I really looking for? What do I want? What is God asking me to do? And again, this affection in prayer just sort of quietens down. You might notice that as you go on in prayer, the prayer becomes a good deal simpler as you get more used to it. And that sometimes you can just, as it were, come into a time of just attentive silence. Now, sometimes when you're walking along with somebody whom you really love, you don't need to be talking to them all the time. You don't need to be talking all the time. But sometimes you just need to be there and be with them and enjoy their company. And this also is very, very true. I pray it's just enjoying the company of God. And then as we end, we can end as we began, with just a quiet, simple prayer asking for God's help. Shortly, in the next part of our evening, I'm going to introduce you to a way of doing that based on one text of Alphonsus. Let me talk a little bit about something that anybody might want to read later on. First of all, the life of Alphonsus. He lived to be over 90, so it's a big, long life. This was written by a Redemptorist called Father Fred Jones. This one here is a collection, as I said, of some of the best extracts of over 100 books that Alphonsus wrote. Some of them were on spirituality, some of them are very short, some of them are fairly lengthy, some of them were in moral theology. And this is a selection of those. I contributed to it myself, wrote a few things on it. This was published some years ago. It's called The Spirituality of St. Alphonsus. And also, I'm going to be talking about the visits of Alphonsus to the Blessed Sacrament. There is a new edition of that. This is not a translation of Alphonsus' work, but it uses Alphonsus' method. It's called Visits to the Blessed Sacrament for the 21st Century. It was published by Redemptorist Communications and written by Father Richard Tobin, a Redemptorist in Esker. It's on sale at the reception in Clonard, and you can get it in other places as well. I've also given you a reference to a recent article in Reality by Father Dennis Billy, an American Redemptorist, on Alphonsus and spiritual direction. Okay, so, thanks.
Thank you.
So let me just, as it were, introduce you to this next thing. We're going to use this text. Well, can you light the candles there?
Yes.
On that? This is a practical example, and for it I am picking one of Alphonsus' best known and best loved books, called Visits to the Blessed Sacrament to the Blessed Virgin Mary. It was written for young fellows, written for the young novices in his congregation, young lads of 16 or 17, who couldn't keep their minds focused for too long and who had to make a visit to the Blessed Sacrament every afternoon. And so what Alphonsus did was he produced this little book of reflection. Some people have sort of said that the way to use it is, say them all as if they're prayers. That's actually to miss the point. Because each of these visits, 31 of them for one day of the month, each day of the month, are organised in a little reflection. And in a reflection and then a set of affections. So I'm going to suggest that I guide you through this evening in the presence of the Blessed Sacrament. I'm going to expose the Blessed Sacrament now, and then I will lead you first of all in the prayer. So as I said to you this evening, just simply focus for a few minutes on the Blessed Sacrament. Just trying to be still. I am going to read a prayer for you. It's the first bit there, it's number 1 on this Alphonsian prayer sheet. You can follow it with me. I'm going to read it because I want to read it simply. I don't want us chasing one another in it. So I just want you to read it very, very slowly. Just follow me as I read it. My Lord Jesus Christ, on account of the love you bear us, you remain night and day in the sacrament, full of compassion and of love, awaiting, calling, and welcoming all who come to visit you. I believe you are present in this sacrament, and I adore you from the depths of my nothingness. I thank you for all the graces you have bestowed on me until now, especially for having given me yourself in this sacrament, for having given me your most holy Mother Mary as my advocate, and for calling me to visit you in this church. I now salute your most loving heart, and this for 3 reasons. In thanksgiving for this great gift, to make amends to you for all the insults you have received in the sacrament. And I intend by this visit to adore you for all the places on earth in which you are present in the sacrament, but the least revered and the most abandoned. My Jesus, I love you with my whole heart. I grieve for having hitherto so many times offended you, but I purpose by your grace never more to offend you for the time to come. And now, unworthy as I am, I consecrate myself to you without reserve. I give you and renounce my entire will, all my loves and all that I possess. For the future, make use of me and all that I have as you please. I recommend to you the souls in purgatory, especially those who had the greatest devotion to the Blessed Sacrament and to the Blessed Virgin Mary. I recommend to you all poor sinners. Finally, my dear Jesus, I unite all my desires with those of the Blessed Virgin Mary, and I offer them so united to the Eternal Father, and ask him for love of you to accept and grant them. What I'm not going to ask you to do is just take that part 2, the text for reflection, and read through it a few times, slowly, and see where it's taking you. What is saying to you about your own life? Have you ever had a sense of wonderful mystery that's contained in the host? Have you any memories of a special holy place? And if you have, go back there. And what did you feel there?